So now we come to the first of two videos talking about the prescribable options in terms of some of the menopausal and perimenopausal symptoms. This first one is about HRT, and it goes through some of the pros and cons and some of the actual information about it. When women come to see me about going through the change, typically they either say something like, I really don't want to take HRT, whatever else you give me, or they're, my friend, sister, colleague at work's taking it, it's wonderful, please can I have it? This is designed to try and help you weigh up some of the pros and cons and decide whether this might be a good option for you. There aren't that many absolutes about HRT. There are a few conditions where we'd say we really don't want to be prescribing it for you. That's if you've had a blood clot in your leg or on your lung, if you've had a heart attack or you suffer from angina, or if you've had breast cancer, we probably don't want you to be taking it. If, however, you've gone through an early change under the age of 40 and typically under the age of 45, then it's something that you may well want to be seriously considering, unless you come in those first categories that I've mentioned. The reason for that is twofold. Firstly, once we know that once you've gone through the change, your bone mass tends to start going down, and obviously the sooner it starts doing that, the higher the risk of brittle bones in later life. Taking HRT for a period of time helps balance your risks to be closer to that of the women that go through the change at 50 to 51. We also know that when women go through the change, the risk of heart disease goes up to become more similar to that of men, who have a higher risk throughout their lives. Now, taking HRT in the early phases, if you've been through an early menopause, may help reduce your risks a little bit in that regard. So those are two reasons why you might want to consider it if you've been through an early change. So what is HRT? Well, if you remember in the first video, we talked about your hormones and particularly your estrogen, and the fact that in the perimenopause it's often very variable and drops in it cause some of the sweats, flushes, sleep problems and things like that. And once you've gone through the menopause, your estrogen level tends to be on a low side permanently. What the HRT does is it replaces the estrogen primarily to help level things out during your perimenopause and hopefully give you just a little bit of a boost in the early stages of your menopause. We've discovered that giving you estrogen alone, if you still have a womb, is not a good idea. So if you haven't had a hysterectomy, then you would generally need combined HRT of some sort. That is estrogen alongside what we call a progestogen, which is a synthetic form of progesterone, which is another female hormone, or a synthetic progesterone compound, which is something that's been developed more recently. Taking that alongside estrogen protects your womb, because if we give estrogen on its own, it gives you a higher risk of cancer of the womb. If you've had a hysterectomy because you've had endometriosis, we tend to give you combined HRT, again, because you may have little pockets of womb-like tissue within your tummy cavity, and there's some risk of giving you estrogen by itself. So what does HRT do? Well, in replacing the hormones, it helps reduce, to some extent, sweats, flushes, may help with the sleep aspects, may help libido, although there are other factors associated with that, and it should help keep the vaginal dryness at bay. Generally, we recommend that you take it for a maximum of about 5 years. The reason for that is to do with increases in risks round about if you're taking it longer than 5 years. This is not an absolute, and generally at 5 years, and I would say at this point that actually that's 5 years after 50 to 51. Most of the data on HRT and risks is in women over the age of 50. There is very little data to suggest that taking it under the age of 50 is of a significant risk for most women. But after the 5 years, some of the risks start going up a little bit more, and so it's debating risks versus benefits for you at that point. But when we do stop it, we stop it gradually, tailing it off, and partly that could be a time of your choosing, and also it tends to reduce symptoms that you may get recurrence. You will get some sweats and flushes on stopping it. How long they last varies considerably. Some women seem to do absolutely fine. Other women are coming back a number of months later and saying, I really want to go back on it because things are awful. So I think it's probably sensible to think of it in terms of borrowing time, but obviously, like I mentioned, the woman at this stage of her life is juggling a lot of plates. Moving the time to a time of your choosing, maybe you're juggling a few less plates at that point, and maybe it's just that little bit easier. And also, to a certain extent, you have a bit more of a control because of weaning it down gradually. So the bit that makes most people scared about taking HRT is the newspaper headlines. I suspect when it was first produced, it was being marketed as this wonder drug that's going to help your heart and keep you young for longer. And as a result of which, a lot of healthy and health-conscious women took it, women who didn't smoke, who exercised. And so initially, looking at populations, it looked like it was really good for your health because it was a self-selecting population who were healthy. Then more women started taking it, and we realised there was an increased risk of breast cancer, but we didn't know how much, and we didn't know whether it protected the heart or otherwise. So wind forward a bit, and about 10 years ago now, there was a big study came out, and that's the one that hit the newspaper headlines. The problem is that newspaper headlines love big numbers, and they love to be scary because that's how they do things. So what they would do, and this is the point at which I usually get my BNF out, this is an out-of-date one, but the table hasn't been changed in it in recent years, and it's got useful data to use as an example. So if I look at the first line here, which is about breast cancer, and looking at women aged between 50 and 59, in 1,000 women not using HRT in Europe, over 5 years we'd expect about 10 of them to develop breast cancer. If we've got 1,000 women in that age range taking combined HRT, that's estrogen plus progestogen, we've got an extra 6 cases per 1,000 women. Now the way the media can produce that is go, that's a 60% increase. Big headline, sounds terrifying, but actually it's 6 in 1,000 women. Not very much at all. And in fact for estrogen only, an extra 2 per 1,000 women taking it for 5 years after the age of 50. Now that's a little bit out of date. There is a slightly more up-to-date chart here, which because we've now realised that the risk does stay with you for a little bit longer than you're taking your HRT. But we're still looking at, if you're using it for 5 years, that there might be an extra 8 cases per 1,000 women if you're using combined HRT. And just trying to find the estrogen one, there might be an extra 3 cases if you're using estrogen only. 3 per 1,000. Nothing like the massive percentages that you're seeing in the papers. So for some women, any risk is too much. For other women, where you're not sleeping at night, your life's a mess, you're struggling marriage-wise because sleep's awful, you're grumpy, and the sweats and the flushes are affecting your ability at work, it may be a really good option for you. So it's worth discussing your risks and your benefits. The other bit is about heart disease, and when it originally hit the headlines, it said that actually the risk of heart disease goes up with HRT. The problem is that was actually based on a particular study in the US, and the population's a bit different from British. They're a little bit older than typically women taking HRT in this country. The average age of women on the study was about 63. Most women have probably stopped taking HRT by 63 in this country. And they were only using one particular tablet-based HRT, which is quite an old-fashioned one. It's got an estrogen made from pregnant horsewee, as opposed to the synthetic ones, which are closer to the more natural hormones that we produce. And it had a progestogen that is manufactured from it's quite what we call androgenic. That is, it's like male hormones, so it may produce extra risks. The other factor is that when they actually looked at the data in more detail, they discovered that the increased risk was actually only in women over the age of 60 who were taking combined HRT. under the age of 60, and further studies have verified this, it certainly doesn't seem to increase your risk of heart disease, and it may actually reduce it depending on which study you're looking at. The other factor is that there have been further studies since then on estrogens, and while the official line at the moment is that in terms of breast cancer that it does slightly increase the risk, there are some studies that suggest it doesn't or may even reduce the risk. So it is an area that is under debate. I think it's probably safer to say there's a slight increase in risk, but it's not massive. It also showed there was an increased risk in blood clots in the leg or on the lung. However, more recent studies have shown that actually if you're using patches or gel as opposed to tablets, it doesn't seem to increase that risk. And it doesn't seem to have an increased stroke risk, again, if you're using patches or gel. The NICE guidelines came out about 5 years ago and were very much in favour of using what we call transdermal methods, which are patches or gel. So it's not quite as scary as it sounds. Everybody's different, but it's worth, if you're struggling with your symptoms, having a serious think about it, unless there are some very good reasons why not. If you decide to be taking HRT, there are lots of different preparations. There are still tablets, however, top at the level in terms of reduced risk NICE guidelines are the patches or the gels. So I suggest unless you have a really good reason for wanting a tablet, you probably won't be wanting to go for those. Differences between patches and gels. Patches, obviously they're adhesive. If you're allergic to stick elastoplast and things like that, it may be a problem. You may prefer to use a gel. The thing about the gel is it's a little bit messier, and you need to have an extra 5 minutes in the morning where you squirt it onto your inner thighs, rub it in and wait for it to dry. However, you then don't have the risk of the patch dropping off. So it's weighing up risks versus benefits there, but that's your estrogen bit. Now the other thing about the gel is it doesn't have a progestogen or progesterone with it, so you'd need to take some tablets or have some other way of having your progesterone on top. If you've got patches, you can have combined ones, however, there are pros and cons to that. So I mentioned early on that if you've got a womb, you need to be having a progestogen alongside it. And there's different ways of doing that. If you're within a year of having had your last natural period, we would be putting you on typically a cyclical pattern. That means you're taking estrogen alone throughout the cycle, and then you're taking progestogen or progesterone for part of the cycle. This means you generally have a regular period again. The reason for that is if we give you both of them together all the way along, in the early days, you tend to get irregular bleeding. And firstly, that's inconvenient, but the other problem is that persistent irregular bleeding can be a sign of something significantly going wrong, like cancer, and it's knowing when to investigate. So generally in the early days, you land up with the sequential. Once you've been a year or more since your period, generally combined HRT using the two hormones alongside each other all the way through the cycle is the usual way of doing things. There's different ways of doing that, and you can have combined preparations that have everything in it, or there are other options that may be slightly lower in risks. At the moment, the data is mixed, but it is looking relatively positive. One of them is if you're still needing some form of contraception, and this works really well in the perimenopause. Having a Mirena coil, which is an intrauterine device with a little bit of progestogen in, that's mostly on the lining of your womb. That can act for up to 5 years to cover your womb, and then you just have your patches or your gel on top. That is pretty low risk. So that's one of your options. And that will work for either sequential or the continuous combined. It doesn't matter. So that covers contraception and HRT. For the right people, that's a win-win situation. For those of you who are needing to take something on top, it depends on what you're wanting to do. What I would say is if you have more than one preparation, and that includes if you've got a box that's got two different types of patches in it, the estrogen ones and the combined ones, because you're on sequential, you get a double prescription charge, and that's quite a bit to be paying. However, it may be worth it. Now, looking at the impact of progesterone or progestogens, there is some early data that suggests that the synthetic progesterones, which are a slightly more recent thing, it's something called utrogestan. It's a microionized progesterone and it's meant to be more similar to what we produce, although it's actually produced from yams. This does seem to be well tolerated in a lot of women, although some women do get side effects with it. It's not absolutely brilliant for everyone, but if tolerated, it does seem to be slightly kinder in a number of ways. It does appear to be better in terms of breast risk as far as we can tell. There are some studies that suggest for up to 5 years of usage, it doesn't actually increase your risk of breast disease, of breast cancer. It also looks like it may be slightly kinder on the arteries than the more androgenic progestogens that are used in the more typical preparations. So for that reason, it may be worth looking at the possibility of actually using a patch or gel and having this as add-back. It's licensed as tablets. It's unlicensed but can be used vaginally. Side effects do include making you a little bit drowsy, so taking it at night, if you do decide to take it, is probably a better option. If it doesn't suit you, there are other preparations out there and there are other things that can be done, but the data as things stand at the moment suggest that using that or a Mirena alongside patches or gel is probably your lowest risk type of HRT. I hope this information is useful. The next one will be about alternatives to HRT if for some reason you either can't take it or for some reason you feel that it just isn't for you.